Rugby, one of the world's most powerful sports, was born from a single act of rule-breaking by a teenage boy who decided, in the middle of a football match, to just pick up the ball and run. That one rebellious moment, that one teenager's decision to ignore the rules, eventually created a sport played in over 120 countries, watched by hundreds of millions and worth billions of dollars. This is the story of rugby. And trust me, you are not ready for how wild this ride gets. To understand where rugby came from, you first have to understand the world it was born into. And that world, it was brutal. It is the early 1800s. England is in the grip of the Industrial Revolution. Cities are swelling with workers pouring in from the countryside. Factories are swallowing childhoods whole. The gap between the rich and the poor is not just wide, it is a chasm. And in the middle of all of that noise, all of that smoke, all of that inequality, ordinary people still found a way to play. Football, not the elegant, tactical, structured game you watch on television today. Not the World Cup, not the Premier League. No, this is football in its oldest, rawest, most primal form. Mob football. Entire villages against each other, sometimes hundreds of men with no boundaries, no fixed rules, no referee, and absolutely no mercy. They played through town centers, over hills, across rivers, and when someone got hurt, they simply kept playing. Can you imagine that? Hundreds of men, one ball, no rules, and an entire village as the pitch. This was not just a game. This was a pressure valve. A controlled, and often not so controlled, explosion of energy from people who had precious little else to celebrate, and the authorities hated it. Town councils tried to ban it. Governments called it dangerous. Priests warned against it from pulpits, but nothing stopped it. Because when you have nothing and football gives you everything, you do not stop. You run harder. And here is something most people do not realize. It was not the streets or the stadiums that first began to shape football into something recognizable. It was the schools. Specifically, the elite, expensive, prestigious boarding schools of England. Because those schools had a problem that football, even chaotic, violent mob football, could help them solve. They needed to control young men. And sport, they discovered, was the most effective tool they had ever found. Which brings me to one school in particular. A school in a small market town in Warwickshire. A school whose name you already know, because it is the...
But here goes Shane Williams. Is there yet live?
Rugby School. And everything...
Magical from Williams!
Rugby School. Founded in 1567. One of the oldest and most prestigious educational institutions in England. By the 1820s, it had developed its own version of football, rough, physical, played across the school grounds with a set of evolving local rules. And the most important rule, you could not run with the ball in your hands. You caught it, you set it down or kicked it. That was the agreement. That was the code. Until one afternoon, the exact year is still debated by historians, but most point to around 1823, a 16-year-old student named William Webb Ellis did something that none of his teammates had dared to do. He was playing in a match. He caught the ball, and then instead of kicking it, he tucked it under his arm and ran, forward, straight through the opposition, toward the goal. He did not trip, he did not stumble, he ran. Now here is what nobody tells you in the romantic version of this story. Webb Ellis was not immediately celebrated as a visionary. He was not carried off the field on the shoulders of cheering classmates. The reaction from the other players: shock, outrage. He was considered a cheat, a boy who could not play by the rules, and for a long time that is exactly what he was seen as. But and this is the crucial thing, the idea did not die with the outrage. Something about that run lodged itself in the minds of the boys who witnessed it. What if you could carry the ball? What if running was allowed? What if the game could be bigger, more physical, more total than anything they had played before? Now I need to be honest with you here because this channel does not deal in myths. Historians have debated the Webb Ellis story for over a century. The earliest written account of it did not surface until 1876, more than 50 years after the event supposedly happened. Some scholars believe it is partly legend, a story that grew over time to give rugby a founding myth, the way all great movements eventually need one. And that is fair. That debate is real. But here is what is not up for debate. Rugby School, in the 1820s and 1830s, genuinely did develop a handling game that was distinct from every other version of football being played in England. And the man most responsible for the culture that made that possible was not a player. He was the headmaster. His name was Thomas Arnold, and without him there is no rugby. Arnold arrived at Rugby School in 1828 and transformed it. He was obsessed with what he called muscular Christianity, the idea that physical endeavor, team sport, and moral character were inseparable. That a boy who could endure pain on the field, who could fight for his team and refuse to surrender, was developing a soul fit for the real world. He believed sport built men. And that philosophy, that sport is not just recreation but formation, became the ideological engine that would eventually carry rugby across the entire British Empire. Think about that. The entire global spread of rugby can be traced in part to the philosophy of one headmaster at one school in one English town. That is how history actually works, not through grand inevitabilities, but through individuals whose ideas outlive them by centuries. But here is where it gets complicated. Because Rugby School's game, however bold, however brilliant, was still just one school's game. And when those boys finished their education and went out into the world, they carried the game with them, and immediately discovered that nobody else played it the same way. Which raises a question that will define the next decade of this story. What happens when a sport has no agreed-upon rules, and everyone thinks their version is the right one? Imagine this. You have grown up playing a game your whole life. You know every rule. You know exactly what is allowed and what is not. And then you show up to play against someone from a different school, a different town, a different club, and they are playing what they call the same game. Except their rules are completely different from yours. In their version, you cannot pick up the ball at all. In yours, you can. In their version, you can trip a player. In yours, that is assault. In their version, there are 12 players on each side. In yours, there could be 60. This was the reality of football in England in the 1840s and 1850s. Organized chaos. Every institution, every town, every club with its own version of the game, and zero agreement on a universal code. It was, in every sense, ungovernable, and something had to change. The first serious attempt came in 1848. A group of students at Cambridge University, many of them alumni of various football-playing schools, gathered together in an effort to create a common set of rules that everyone could play by. The Cambridge Rules of 1848. It was a noble effort, and it helped. But it did not solve the central problem, because the rugby men, the handlers, the carriers, were not willing to give up what made their game unique. And so the real question became, can one sport contain both ideas? Can football be both a kicking game and a carrying game, or was a split inevitable? The answer came on the evening of October 26, 1863. London, the Freemasons' Tavern. A group of clubs and schools had gathered to finally do what needed to be done, form a unified governing body for football, the Football Association. It should have been a moment of unity. Instead, it became the defining rupture in the history of sport. Because when the association's founders put forward their proposed rules that explicitly banned carrying the ball and banned hacking, which was the practice of kicking opponents in the shins, the rugby men erupted. Banning hacking, they were furious. They called it cowardly. One representative stood up and declared, and I am paraphrasing here, that without hacking, football would become a game for girls. He said it publicly, in a meeting. And when the vote went against them, the rugby representatives walked out. They walked out, and they never came back. That walkout, that single act of institutional defiance, gave the world two sports instead of one. Association football on one side, the handling game rugby on the other hand. And from that moment their paths diverged completely. One would become the most popular sport on earth. The other would become the most physically complete, spiritually intense, and culturally rich contact sport the world has ever known. But a walkout is only the beginning. You still need a structure, you still need laws, you still need a governing body to hold it all together. And that came 8 years later on January 26, 1871, when 21 clubs gathered in London and founded the Rugby Football Union, the RFU. For the first time in history, rugby was not just a game. It was an institution. It had laws. It had an identity. It had power. And I want you to hold that date in your mind, 1871. Because from this moment forward, rugby does not just survive. It grows, it travels, it transforms, and it begins collecting enemies and allies in equal measure. The next century will test everything that rugby thinks it is through class war, through empire, through world war, through apartheid, through the greatest internal crisis a sport has ever faced. And all of it, every single moment of conflict, every revolution, every rupture, will eventually build toward a stage so massive, a moment so powerful, that a man who spent 27 years in prison would put on a rugby jersey and hold a trophy above his head while 60,000 people wept. But we are not there yet, and you cannot understand that moment, not really, until you understand what is coming next. Because the birth of rugby was just Act 1, the battle for its soul. That is where things get truly explosive. Rugby Football Union, founded, official, powerful. The sport had its laws, it had its governing body, and on the surface, it had its future locked in. But here is what the men sitting in that London meeting room in 1871 did not understand, did not want to understand. Rugby had just been handed a lit fuse, and it was burning faster than any of them knew. Because the story does not get simpler from here. It gets darker, it gets more explosive, and it gets personal in a way that no one inside those polished meeting rooms was prepared for. What does it cost a sport to choose pride over people? You are about to find out. I need you to picture something for me. It is a Saturday afternoon somewhere in Yorkshire, England, 1880-something. A man, let us call him Thomas, rolls out of a coal mine at 5 in the morning. He has been underground since before the sun came up. His back aches. His lungs are full of dust, and he has one single thing, to look forward to before the week starts all over again. Rugby, his club, his team, his identity. Thomas is not playing for money. He cannot play for money. The Rugby Football Union has made that absolutely, unambiguously clear. Rugby is an amateur sport, a gentleman's sport. You play for the love of the game and nothing else. No payment, no compensation, no exceptions. That is the rule. But here is the thing the Rugby Football Union did not want to acknowledge. Thomas is not a gentleman. Thomas is a coal miner. And when Thomas misses a Saturday shift to travel to an away fixture, Thomas does not get paid. In the economy that Thomas lives in, a missed shift does not mean a smaller bonus at the end of the quarter. It means his family does not eat properly that week. So here is the question that was tearing rugby apart from the inside. Who does this sport actually belong to? The men in the blazers, the administrators, the committee members, the former public schoolboys who ran the Rugby Football Union from London, had a very clear answer. Rugby belonged to the game, to the traditions, to the principles of amateurism that had made sport noble and pure and untainted by commerce. They believed this genuinely, and they enforced it ruthlessly. But the men in the mud, the miners and mill workers and factory hands of Yorkshire and Lancashire, who had made rugby the most passionately followed sport in the industrial north, they had a different answer. Rugby belonged to the people who played it, and the people who played it were being asked to sacrifice wages they could not afford to lose in order to serve a principle invented by people who had never worried about a wage in their lives. The tension had been building for years. Clubs in the north had been quietly compensating players for broken time, money lost due to playing, in ways that technically violated the RFU's amateur code. The union knew. They turned a blind eye for a while, And then they stopped turning the blind eye. They began investigating clubs, suspending players, threatening expulsions. And that is when the North decided, enough. August 29th, 1895. The George Hotel, Huddersfield, Yorkshire. 21 clubs gathered around tables in a meeting room that smelled of wood polish and old grievances. There were men in this room who had played rugby together for decades. Men who had bled on the same pitches, who knew each other's running lines and defensive patterns as well as they knew their own faces. And now they were about to do something that would permanently, irrevocably split the sport in two. The vote was taken. The motion passed. The 21 clubs formally resigned from the Rugby Football Union and declared themselves a new governing body, the Northern Rugby Football Union, later renamed Rugby League. Just like that, one meeting, one vote, one rupture that has never fully healed. And here is what nobody talks about enough. The RFU did not just let them go. They made them pay. Any player who joined the breakaway league was immediately and permanently banned from ever playing rugby union again. Not suspended, banned, for life. Players who had given everything to the game, their bodies, their Saturdays, their youth, were declared persona non grata by the establishment they had helped build. And that ban, that spiteful, vindictive, class-soaked ban, stayed in place for 100 years. 100 years. It was not lifted until 1995. Let that sink in. A grudge held for a century, over money for missed wages, over whether a working man deserved the same right to play as a gentleman. If you ever want to understand how deeply class ran through the veins of Victorian Britain, you do not need a history textbook. You just need to look at what rugby did to itself in 1895. But here is the twist, and rugby history is full of them. The split, as devastating as it was, did not kill either code. It made them both more distinct, more specialized, more committed to their own identities. Rugby Union kept its 15 players, its rucks and mauls, its global reach through the British Empire. Rugby League kept its 13 players, its faster pace, its working-class northern heartland. 2 sports, 1 name, and a century of bitterness separating them. But while rugby was tearing itself apart at home, something extraordinary, something unstoppable, was happening on the other side of the world. And this part of the story is what transforms rugby from a British sport into a global religion. The British Empire, at its peak, the largest empire in the history of the world, covering a quarter of the Earth's land surface, connecting continents, consuming cultures, imposing language, law, and trade wherever it reached. And tucked inside that empire, carried in the kit bags and cultural instincts of every British soldier, missionary, teacher, and civil servant who ever boarded a ship, was a rugby ball. Wherever Britain went, rugby followed. And here is the thing about that ball: it did not stay British for long, because the people who received it did not just play the game, they owned it. They transformed it. They made it a vehicle for something the empire had never anticipated: national identity, cultural pride, and in some cases, outright resistance. Let me take you to 3 places that prove this more powerfully than anything else. South Africa. Rugby arrived in the Cape Colony in the 1860s, brought by British settlers and military officers. Within 2 decades, it had spread beyond the British community to the Afrikaner population, the Dutch-descended settlers who had their own complicated, often hostile relationship with British colonialism. And something remarkable happened. The Afrikaners did not reject rugby as a British imposition. They adopted it as their own. Rugby became a vehicle for Afrikaner identity, Afrikaner pride, a way of beating the British at their own game, literally. The Springboks were born. A team whose green and gold would come to carry an entire nation's self-image on its back. For better and, as we will see, for far, far worse. But if South Africa gave rugby passion, New Zealand gave it something closer to the sacred. New Zealand, the All Blacks, 3 words that, anywhere in the world, need no further explanation. Rugby arrived in New Zealand in the 1870s, and it fused almost immediately with Maori culture in a way that produced something entirely unique. The Maori people, the indigenous Polynesian inhabitants of New Zealand, did not just accept rugby, they elevated it. They brought to the game a ferocity, a physicality, and a spiritual intensity that transformed the All Blacks into the most dominant national team in the history of any sport. Think about that claim for a moment, the most dominant national team in the history of any sport. From a country of 5 million people. That is what happens when a sport becomes more than a game. That is what happens when it becomes identity. And then there is the haka. If you have never watched the All Blacks perform the haka before a test match, I want you to stop whatever you are doing after this video and find it, because no description I give you will do it justice. 15 men. Black jerseys, eyes that could cut through steel, feet striking the earth with the force of something ancient, tongues out, voices raised in a war challenge rooted in Maori tradition, performed on the rugby field as both honor and warning. To the opposing team it says, "We see you, we respect you, and we are going to dismantle you." What does a war cry performed before a sporting match tell you about how seriously a nation takes its rugby? Everything. It tells you everything. And then there are the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, nations so small they do not register on most maps of geopolitical power. Nations where per capita income is a fraction of the rugby powerhouses they regularly defeat. Nations that sent their sons to New Zealand, to Australia, to Europe, with rugby as their passport, their scholarship, their shot at a life beyond subsistence. The Pacific Islands did not play rugby to entertain the empire. They played it to survive. And then they played it to win. And the world had better remember that, because soon I will show you exactly what Fiji did when they finally got their moment on the Olympic stage. Across the channel, France had been developing its own explosive relationship with rugby since the 1870s. The French did not just adopt the game, they reinvented its emotional temperature. French rugby became passionate to the point of chaos, individualistic to the point of anarchy, and glorious precisely because of it. The Argentines took it and made it a fortress. The Japanese took it and made it discipline itself. Rugby was no longer a British game exported to the world. It was the world's game, shaped by every hand that touched it. But then came the storms, and I do not mean storms on a rugby pitch. I mean world wars, real ones. And what those wars did to rugby and what rugby did in response is a chapter that demands its own moment of silence. In the 1914 war, rugby, like everything else, stopped. No, that is not quite right. It did not just stop, it marched. Because when the call came to enlist, rugby clubs across Britain and across the empire responded with a kind of collective courage that is almost impossible to fathom today. Entire club teams enlisted together, men who had played alongside each other for years, who knew each other's running lines and defensive patterns as well as they knew their own faces, signed up for the same regiment, boarded the same ships, walked into the same fire. The Barbarians, the London Scottish, clubs whose rosters would never be the same again. How many men who should have been playing rugby were instead buried in Flanders mud? The number is a wound that never fully closed. By 1918, the game was a ghost of itself. Grounds used as training fields, balls deflated and stored. Players who came home changed, quieter, heavier, carrying things no match program would ever list as a statistic. But they resumed. They always resumed. Because rugby at its core is about getting back up. And the sport that returned after both world wars was harder, more grateful, and more aware of what it was playing for than the sport that had left. But the post-war years brought rugby a different kind of war. One fought not with guns but with silence, with exclusion, with the slow, suffocating violence of a system that decided some people were worth less than others. And rugby, shamefully, for decades played along. South Africa, apartheid, the institutionalized racial segregation of a nation, enforced by law, by violence, and by the quiet cooperation of international partners who valued winning tour over human dignity. The Springboks, South Africa's national rugby team, were selected exclusively from the white population under apartheid. Non-white South Africans were barred from the national team, from the stadiums, from the game. And the international rugby community continued to tour South Africa. They kept playing. They kept shaking hands. They kept taking the photographs. There were voices of protest, growing, insistent, righteous voices. In the 1960s, the anti-apartheid movement began targeting those tour. Activists occupied rugby pitches. Protesters stormed fields mid-match. Governments were pressured. And the most explosive confrontation of all came in 1981 when the Springboks toured New Zealand. A nation that prided itself on racial equality was torn in half by the decision to allow that tour to proceed. Protesters clashed with police. A light aircraft flew over Eden Park during a test match and dropped flour bombs on the pitch. Families were divided. Friendships ended. And still, for years, the major rugby nations continued to send teams to South Africa, citing the separation of sport and politics, a position that, in hindsight, history has judged with the severity it deserves. Rugby had a moral reckoning coming, and it arrived. South Africa was eventually expelled from international rugby, banned, isolated. And when apartheid finally collapsed and the walls came down, rugby was handed a moment of redemption so powerful it belongs not just in a sports documentary, but in the history of human civilization itself. But that moment comes in later on in this video, and it is worth every second of the wait. Because before we get there, before we get to redemption, rugby had one more crisis to survive. The biggest identity crisis it had ever faced. A crisis that had been building for over 100 years. The amateur lie. And the day it finally, spectacularly, died. I told you earlier that rugby had an amateur code it held sacred. 124 years. That is how long Rugby Union had maintained the fiction, and I use that word deliberately, the fiction that its players competed purely for love of the game. No pay, no contracts, no agents. You were an amateur sportsman or you were nothing. But let me ask you something. When a player trains 6 days a week, travels internationally 10 months a year, and risks serious physical injury every single time he steps onto that pitch, is that amateur? Is that love of the game? Or is that a job that happens to not come with a salary? The hypocrisy had been an open secret for decades. Top players received cash payments under the table, brown envelopes after matches, employment arrangements from club sponsors that required no actual work. The administrators knew, the players knew, the journalists knew, everyone knew. And everyone pretended otherwise, because the myth of amateurism was the foundational identity of rugby union. The thing that separated it from rugby league, the thing that justified its sense of superiority, the thing the Blazers and committees had built their entire self-image around. But by 1995, the myth was under attack from every direction. Rugby league was openly professional and was poaching union's best players with life-changing contracts. Television companies were circling the sport with checkbooks the size of continents. The 1995 Rugby World Cup in South Africa, the tournament of Mandela, of the Springboks, of 60,000 people singing and weeping at the same time, had just demonstrated to the entire business world that rugby was a global spectacle worth astronomical sums of money. And then Rupert Murdoch moved. $555 million. That was the number. Murdoch's News Corporation offered $555 million to SANZAR, the newly formed alliance of South Africa, New Zealand, and Australian rugby, for broadcasting rights to a new professional competition. $555 million that could not be accessed unless the sport went professional. The RFU and the other unions could hold out against the players. They could hold out against public opinion. They could not hold out against $555 million. August 27, 1995, 26 days after the Rugby World Cup final. The International Rugby Board, the global governing body of rugby union, announced that the sport was now an open game. Professional, unrestricted, players could be paid, openly, legally, without shame. 124 years of amateurism, gone, in a single announcement. And the aftermath was chaotic does not cover it. Clubs began signing players to contracts they had no idea how to structure. Player agents appeared overnight. Transfer wars erupted between clubs and national unions. The game's entire administrative architecture had been built for a world where money did not officially exist, and now it was being flooded with it. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. And it was completely, irreversibly unstoppable. Here is what professionalism actually meant. It meant that for the first time in over a century, the people giving everything to rugby could receive something back, not in secret, not in brown envelopes, but in contracts, in dignity, in the simple acknowledgement that what they did was worth paying for. Rugby had spent 124 years pretending the working man did not belong at the table. First in 1895, when it drove the northern clubs out for daring to ask for broken time payments. Then, for a century of enforced amateurism that primarily protected the privileged and punished everyone else. And now, finally, it had done what it should have done 100 years earlier. It is too late for Thomas the coal miner. It is too late for the men who were banned for life in 1895. But it is not too late for the sport. Because with professionalism came investment, and with investment came growth. And with growth came something rugby had been building toward since that teenage boy ran with a ball in Warwickshire in 1823. A stage, the biggest stage in all of sport, a World Cup, and a moment, a single, unscripted, unrepeatable moment of human grace that would make the entire planet stop and watch. We have been through a rebellion. We have been through a class war. We have been through 2 world wars, a century of hypocrisy, and a moral reckoning that nearly destroyed the sport's international standing. And now, I want to ask you one final question before we close this story. After everything rugby survived, every schism, every scandal, every century of pride and cruelty and courage, did it earn its place among the greatest sports the world has ever known? Stay with me, because the answer is not just yes. The answer is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of organized sport, and it begins with a stage that had to be built from scratch. 1987. New Zealand and Australia co-host the first-ever Rugby World Cup. 16 nations. No billion-dollar sponsorships. No global broadcast machine. Just the game, the players, and a quiet but unshakable belief that rugby deserved a world stage. The All Blacks won it. They were dominant, brilliant, and inevitable, and the world just barely noticed. But a seed had been planted, and seeds, given the right conditions, do not stay small for long. 1991. The tournament moved to Europe. Australia won. The crowds grew, the coverage expanded, and somewhere in the back rooms of broadcasting companies and commercial sponsors, people were beginning to pay attention to the numbers. 1995. South Africa. The newly democratic South Africa, freed from apartheid, invited back to the international stage after years of isolation, hosting the Rugby World Cup for the first time. And what happened on June 24, 1995, in Johannesburg, is the moment I have been building toward since the very first sentence of this video. Nelson Mandela walked onto Ellis Park Stadium wearing a Springbok jersey, number 6, Francois Pienaar's number. A man who had spent 27 years in a prison cell, partly because of the regime that the Springbok jersey had once represented, stood before 60,000 South Africans, black and white, and raised that jersey above his head. And Pienaar, the Springbok captain, a white Afrikaner, received the World Cup trophy from Mandela's hands. And the stadium did not just cheer. It wept. The whole country wept. Rugby had not just played a game that day. It had participated, however briefly and imperfectly, in the healing of a nation. When sport transcends itself, When it becomes a vessel for something larger than victory or defeat, that is the moment it becomes immortal. That is the moment rugby became immortal. And the World Cup kept growing. 1999 brought the tournament to Wales and a 20-team format that reflected rugby's genuine global spread. 2003 gave England and the world Johnny Wilkinson, a drop goal, extra time, 92,000 people in Sydney holding their breath as the ball spiraled through the posts, and England became world champions for the first time. A single kick that an entire generation of rugby supporters can replay in their minds frame by frame, even now. 2007, 2011, 2015. The World Cup growing in stature, in viewership, in commercial weight with every edition. And then 2019, Japan. The tournament that changed everything again. Japan 2019 was the first Rugby World Cup held in Asia, and it announced, loudly and unmistakably, that rugby's geography had permanently shifted. Japan's own Brave Blossoms, a team that had once been written off as a tournament also-ran, stunned Ireland, stunned Scotland, reached the quarterfinals on home soil in front of a nation that had fallen completely and irreversibly in love with the sport. Over 850 million viewers across the tournament. Rugby had arrived in Asia, and it was never going back. But if the World Cup was rugby's coronation, the Olympics was its passport to the entire world. Rugby had actually appeared in the early Olympic Games, 1900, 1908, 1920, 1924, and then it vanished from the program for 92 years. 92 years. But in 2016, Rugby Sevens, the shorter, faster, more explosive 7A-side version of the game, returned to the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. And what happened in that stadium rewrote the definition of what a sporting moment can mean to a small nation. Fiji won gold, their first Olympic medal of any kind, in any sport, in their entire history as a nation. The Fiji Prime Minister declared a national holiday. The entire island erupted not in noise but in something that went deeper than noise, in release, in pride, in the collective joy of a small Pacific nation standing on the highest podium in all of sport and saying, simply, we are here, we belong, we won. Rugby had not just given Fiji a gold medal. It had given an entire people a moment of dignity that no colonial history, no geopolitical obscurity, no size on a map could ever take away from them. And women's rugby was building its own revolution at the same time. The Women's Rugby World Cup, growing in profile with every edition. Women's sevens at the Olympics drawing audiences who had never watched rugby before and could not stop watching once they started. Rugby was no longer a sport for one gender, one class, one nation, or one hemisphere. It was everyone's game now. And the numbers proved it. World Rugby's investment in developing nations was bringing the sport to new communities across Africa, across Asia, across the Americas, in a growth wave that showed no signs of slowing. We started with a teenage boy in Warwickshire who picked up a ball and ran with it against the rules. And we end here, with a sport played in over 120 countries, generating billions in annual revenue, capable of healing post-apartheid nations, delivering Olympic gold to Pacific Island communities, and drawing nearly 1 billion viewers to a single tournament in Asia. That is not just growth, that is transformation, and transformations of that scale do not happen by accident. They happen because the thing at the center of it all, the sport itself, contains something true. Something that resonates across languages, across cultures, across centuries. Rugby is the sport that keeps teaching the same lesson in every era, that the most powerful thing in the world is a person, or a team, that refuses to stay down. Webb Ellis refused to stay within the rules. The Northern clubs refused to stay silent about wages. The All Blacks refused to let colonialism define what Maori people could achieve on a sports field. The Springboks and Mandela refused to let history be the last word. Fiji refused to accept that small nations did not belong on the highest podium. And rugby, The sport itself refused, again and again, to be contained by the class systems, the politics, the moral failures, and the commercial hesitations of the institutions built around it. That is the story of rugby, not just how it started, not just how it gained fame, but why it deserved to. And now you know exactly how a teenage boy's forbidden run became one of the most powerful movements in the history of human sport. Before you go, I need you to do something for me. Right now, before you click away before the next video starts, think about what we covered today. A sport that began with one act of defiance in 1823, that survived a class war in 1895, that carried empires and challenged apartheid, that gave the world the haka, Mandela's jersey, Johnny Wilkinson's drop goal, and Fiji's first-ever Olympic gold. And ask yourself honestly, did you know all of that before today? If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a fact that surprised you, a moment that moved you, then do one thing: hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells us that stories like this one are worth telling. And if you want more, because there is so much more to explore on this channel, more famous breakthroughs, more untold origin stories, more moments where ordinary people changed everything, subscribe. Ring the bell. Join this community. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, which moment in rugby's story hit you the hardest? Was it the George Hotel walkout in 1895? Was it Mandela in the Springbok jersey? Was it Fiji's Olympic gold? Or was it something else entirely? Drop it below. Because the best part of a story is the conversation it starts, and I want to have that conversation with you. I will see you in the next breakthrough.